Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and on behalf of the Dean and Chapter, welcome to Liverpool Cathedral. My name is Canon Mike Kirby, and I'm the organiser of these lectures, and it's a delight to welcome you here to this, our first in-person Gilbert Scott Lecture on Science and Faith for 2024. If you're interested in the series that we've been having of lectures on science and faith since 2019, and background behind the lecture series, please take a look at the A5 information sheets, and there's a link there to a dedicated web page, which for most of the years we have the videos and the recordings of previous lectures, so do take a look at that. And it will give you some background behind the definition for this series. These lectures are completely free and reflecting the welcome and the encounter we have here at Liverpool. But there's always costs to cover in holding these evenings. So I'd ask if you might consider a donation in the baskets at the end, if you wish. Thank you very much for all the previous help that you've given us over the years. It's much appreciated. Finally, before we get on with the really interesting part of this evening, please also consider completing the questionnaires. There are pens at the back if you don't have them really, and we'll complete the evening with plenty of time for questions, but also for you to complete that. But also our speaker tonight has brought a lot of material from the Faraday Institute, including her own books, on one of which this lecture is based upon. And there's sign-up sheets and so on, so we'll give you plenty of time to do that, and indeed ask Ruth some further questions if you wish. So without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ruth Bancewicz. Ruth is the Church Engagement Director at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge. She comes to us this evening courtesy of the Montgomery Trust and is going to speak about God in the Lab, how science enhances faith. Ladies and gentlemen, please we welcome Ruth Bancewicz.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here, to be able to meet those of you who are here in person, and also, how do I say hello to the audience who are watching in future online. Anyway, hello. So I'm, as Mike has said, thank you for inviting me here, and I work at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, which is an academic institute where interdisciplinary research is done on different topics between science and religion, but also a number of us work to help people get involved in conversations about science and faith. We have a youth and schools team. I work with churches. We do other work with public lectures and things like that, so do check it out. We run short courses. We have resources online, as well as obviously the lectures you have here, Gilbert Scott Lectures, which are fantastic to be involved, and you've got all the recordings of those as well. My background is in genetics. I left the lab 20 years ago now, nearly 20 years ago, and have been writing resources and meeting people in churches ever since. I first worked for Christians in Science. It does what it says on the tin, so if that sounds like you, I brought some of their leaflets along, some of our leaflets, I should say. I'm still a member, as well as things from the Faraday Institute. And I've led 3 projects on science and faith, and then in 2018 was made the Church Engagement Director, and all that time, just as a biologist or former biologist, you kind of never lose it. Really interested in lots of different topics to do with science and faith. I just wanted to find out about those of you who are here. I can't talk to all of you before the lecture, but just wanted to see a little bit of a show of hands, just to find out who would say you've got some kind of scientific background. I'm not expecting one. It's not necessary. Also, who would count yourself as being or having been a research scientist of sorts? Okay, 1 or 2. No, that's great. So this lecture is for everyone, whether you have a science background or not, but it's just good to find out. Can I find out who tends to come to things at the cathedral? Any of you sort of cathedral regulars? Okay, yeah, that's also interesting to know. And who's been to one of these science lectures before? Okay, Great. Okay, I'm all clued in now. Thanks very much. So a few hands up for each of those questions, if you're wondering online. So I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about what is science, because I know some of you know very well. Actually, those of us who studied science, we don't always talk about this. We don't always do the philosophy of science. Basically, it's about gathering evidence for things. If you can weigh it, if you can observe it, if you can measure it, you can science it, basically. It's about looking at all the data you gather, all the measurements you gather, and trying to come up with general principles about the way the world is, often described in mathematical equations. Scientific knowledge is always provisional. If it's not provisional, it's not science. We're always trying to disprove each other. You can't prove anything scientifically, only mathematicians do proof, but scientists try and disprove each other a lot of the time because it's done by humans and it's really easy to fool yourself. We've all got our different filters we look through the world, look at the world through, and we need to help each other to spot our blind spots or the things we don't notice or the things we're extra excited about and maybe give more emphasis to. We have to try and even things out for each other. So our science lab meetings are often very critical and slightly scary. And if you can get through that filter, you know you're probably good to publish your work. If your colleagues have let you go after the lab meeting. We work together to reduce our bias. We collaborate, we review each other's work. And the aim is always to be getting nearer to the truth in the end. That's the whole point. We want, it's sometimes a little bit 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. It feels like, or 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. The other way around would be really sad. Sometimes it is, but mostly the other way around, like slow progress, but really interesting. Lots of work, but lots of reward on the way. And one of the rewards that I really want to talk about tonight is beauty. When I wrote God in the Lab, I really wanted to showcase the kind of conversations that scientists kind of have in their spare time. If you're a marine biologist, the beauty is fairly obvious, often. I mean, this is stunning. And I have to say, a lot of the images I'm using come from another project called Wonders of the Living World. I have a few books for that at the back. It's got a lot of pictures in it. It is for grown-ups, I have to say. Maybe an extremely bright young person might enjoy it, but the text is written for grown-ups. But all these incredible scientists let me use their images in that book. Because beauty, I think beauty is largely in the eye of the beholder. And I think most scientists tend to have a thing in their work that they think is very beautiful. Other people might not agree. But you might be able to appreciate their enthusiasm. And since I published God in the Lab, someone called Brandon Vaidyanathan, who's a professor of sociology, chair of the sociology department at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., he did this survey with collaborators in 4 different countries, chosen because he speaks the languages in these countries, as you do, and being multilingual. And they looked at physicists and biologists, did nearly 3,500 surveys and 200 in-depth interviews. It was all done during COVID time. They asked a lot of questions about well-being because they wanted to kind of disguise the fact it was really a survey about beauty, because they didn't want people, all the beauty lovers, to jump on the bandwagon and, spoil the results by skewing it. So they did a well-being survey, and along the way they asked questions about beauty. And they found, this is slime mold, by the way. So it's basically a hungry, it's hungry slime mold that's formed fruiting bodies to try and send its, spores off somewhere else to find more food. But I think it is like Christmas decorations to me. And they found that 75% of the scientists who responded to this survey found something in the things that they study beautiful, whether it's an equation or a slime mold. 61% of people found beauty in the more abstract scientific theories they were working on, 52% in the process of their research, and 54% during the process of their teaching. I remember one of my colleagues who said he had this kind of epiphany moment at some points when he was studying things down the microscope, and he really wanted to share that with his students. That was one of his drivers. So I think, people are encountering beauty in all kinds of ways. And the writing's small here, I'm really sorry, but I will read it out. So this is a bar chart of dark green bars is the physicists, and the yellow bars are the biologists, and the pale green bits at the top of all the bars is the statistics. That's the error bars. If they overlap, there's not really a difference between the physicists and the biologists' experience of beauty. So the first one, where there's a massive difference between the physicists and the biologists. Can I will my pointer show? Oh, my pointer shows up. This one here. You can see there's a massive difference. This is appreciation of symmetry. Physicists love symmetry. Biologists aren't that bothered. And then everyone likes elegance. Everyone likes hidden order or patterns. Everyone likes inner logic of systems. And then here's one of the distinctives. Biologists like pleasing colors or shapes. I am one of those people. And physicists are not that bothered. Biologists really love appreciating complexity, whereas physicists like simplicity. It's interesting, isn't it? And I think some of those appreciations is part of your training. Physicists are looking for simple ways to describe things. Biologists are appreciating the complexity of the living world that is incredible. So there's another beautiful thing. It's a neuron, it's a nerve cell. And part of the reason I find this so beautiful is because it's really difficult taking these pictures, preparing the cell, getting the microscope set up, the whole thing. This is very skilled work. And this scientist who produced this might not have that many photos like this in their career. It's probably one of the best. They'll use it on all their presentations for like the next 10 years. And in this study, Brandon and his colleagues, in the end, they looked at all the different kinds of beauty that people were appreciating. And this is just his slide that I've borrowed. There's a first kind of beauty, which he called simple beauty. So you could call it sort of basic beauty. It's not to do with simplicity, but it's the sort of appearances of things. Sensory experiences, colors, shapes, equations that are nice. If you're working with equations, you'll get a feel for ones you like. And it's just beauty that strikes people. And then there's a second kind of beauty that they called useful beauty. Some people find beauty helpful as a pointer to truth. And this will happen in certain fields of science at certain points of time. There will be kinds of beauty that are almost a guide to truth. And then the third kind of beauty is the beauty of understanding. Now, the kind of, the way that the data point to further experiments or further, oh, look, this maybe indicates that if we look a bit more, we can find out how it works in another, at a higher level. Or, now we understand it. Think about the periodic table. It just slotted into this incredible, if you've studied chemistry and know the periodic table, it just slots into this incredible pattern, all the chemical elements. That's the beauty of understanding. And you kind of have to experience it to appreciate it. And that simple beauty is fine. It's part of what helps us get out of bed in the morning. I'm going to play with my pretty cells, or something. Or I've got a nice equation to work on. The useful beauty is a bit dangerous because it got Einstein into trouble. He thought a new development in physics, quantum mechanics, was ugly and he ignored it. He was wrong. He got into trouble. Physicists are really wary of people who are saying, no, it's beautiful, it's true. And it's a little bit controversial, so because there are fashions, there are trends, and sometimes the new understanding people may reject because it's not trendy. It's not a trendy kind of beautiful. But the beauty of understanding, just growing in knowledge and seeing the way things in the world fit together is something to focus on that's helpful. So this is nothing to do with science and religion right now. I'm just painting a bit of a picture of what it's like. Those of you who've worked in science, hopefully, some of this is resonating with you. You can enjoy memories. These are worms. This is a little bit of beauty in the eye of the beholder. We have a giant version of this up in the Faraday Institute, and our new exec director said, don't put that facing my office. Once he found out what they were, these little tiny worms. Okay, they're not gut worms. They're ones that live in the soil. They're friendly worms, C. elegans. They're very useful for working in the lab. I think it's beautiful that somebody mapped out where all their cells go. 900 something cells in their body, and we know exactly where they come from, where they're going, and what they do. So simple, and they've got so many similarities with our own bodies. Doesn't look like it, but they do. It's very useful in the lab. And as well as beauty, I really appreciate the creativity of the people who can find things like that out. Okay, it's partly sheer bloody-minded hard work. This guy wore a rut. One of my lecturers did, I think, their PhD with this guy. He wore a rut in his lab floor with his wheelie chair, going from his microscope to his lab book. That is patience. But the creativity, and since his time, I love the creativity of some of these worms are red, and I rather suspect that is because they've been tagged. There are cells or a gene that has been tagged with a fluorescent marker so you can see what it's up to. It's really useful. You can see where it goes in the body, when it appears, when it disappears. It's incredibly useful for understanding how the worm's body is working, for understanding disease processes and diseases that affect humans as well as worms. So that creativity is incredible, and this is one of my favorite experiments. So this is what molecular biologists do. They fiddle with tiny tubes, and you'll have a pipette, and you're pipetting sort of a quarter of a microliter, tiny amounts you can hardly see of liquid in and out of little tubes like this. You get very good at flipping the tiny lids on and off. Separating bits of DNA using water and chemicals, dangerous chemicals, and making pictures like this. And all this is for one of the things you can do with this is cutting and splicing bits of DNA. Okay, so the outcome is intellectually very stimulating. The process on the way is just, you have to be a complete perfectionist. It's a little bit tedious, but the outcome's very exciting. So this guy, Walter Gehring, very, very creative. He wanted to know what this gene, I'll call it PAX6 because that's what it's called in some of the organisms I worked with. We now know it's got something, it's a regulator of eye development. But he wanted to test, what does it do? So he spliced this bit of DNA, this bit of gene, into a fruit fly DNA, into the region of the DNA that controlled the growth of the fly's appendages. Okay, arms, legs, wings, wherever one of these appendages has to grow. There's a little patch of cells where the appendage will grow from. And that little patch of cells, he put this gene in there. And I'm not going to show you the actual pictures because they're a little bit gross and they're also a little bit indistinct. You kind of have to know fruit flies quite well. I've stared at them a lot to see. So I've made my own picture. Basically, they grew eyes all over the place. So he wanted to know what this gene did. He put it into the fly's body and could see in these special places where appendages grew, and the appendages all turned into eyes. So he knew what this gene did. It's gross. is totally gross. I'm sorry, I'll move swiftly on. But it's really powerful. And the experiments even, they're a bit more abstract and less exciting, less gross, but the experiments to understand DNA and how it worked, some of them were beautifully elegant, so simple, so simple. But anyway, that would take a whole hour to go through all those. But really, really, really creative. And people often think of scientists as kind of like a bit boring, just going through the motions, little bit robotic, maybe unemotional, but would have to be incredibly creative, even just to get a new machine to work, or a very old one. Have to be very creative. And here's another picture of, it's a cell with the stripy bits are its skeleton, which help it to move around. Very, very different to our skeleton. And the bit in the middle, the blue patch, is the DNA, I think. And again, getting a picture like that, getting your equipment to work, figuring out how to make all this, beautiful images. So this guy, Howard Vinden, let us use his picture, and it's, like one of the star pictures on Wikipedia, and he won't have many pictures like that, and, but he shared it with us, and huge amount of creativity just to troubleshoot, try new ways of making new images. Or turn the microscope around, you've got a telescope. Although this was taken with a space telescope. This was the James Webb, I think. And then you're experiencing awe, wonder, and awe. And I think one of the real definitions of awe is that sort of feeling of being a little bit overwhelmed. It's something you've got to get your head around. You've got to readjust the parameters of the way you saw the world as you try and get your head around the way things are. Those are the mountaintop experiences. And when I interviewed scientists about, God in the Lab essentially was a project where I said, let's go out on the front foot. We've done a lot of responding to issues on science and religion. And I was challenged to say, how would you start the conversation? And I thought, yeah, okay. So I went to people and said, if someone said to you, science and your faith, what do you want to talk about? What's cool? And awe was one of the things they talked about. And they often started using mountain metaphors, talking about the moment in their career when everything fell into place and they found something new. And there might not be many of them, but that was what they lived for. And sort of mind being blown. And you read the stories of people who get Nobel Prizes, and there was one, I've forgotten who it was now, but he was slightly, almost frightened by the work he'd done, the way it had fallen into place, and he could see sort of deeper truths that might emerge from this new way of understanding the world. And wow, the potential was, almost like standing on a mountain and seeing this massive view. So I'm going to just try and capture some of that awe before I get onto the sciencey, faithy stuff. And give you a bit of a scientific story. This is not really an experiment anyone would do, but just to help you capture some of that sense of awe. Here's some more cells. These are all from a lot of these are from the Wellcome Trust, actually. Some of the ones I'm using, they have this gallery of images that's online. All these stunning, stunning images that people have donated. And so the cells are the building blocks of our bodies. The word came from the monks' cells, all lined up in the monastery, but they're too small to see. The yellow bit in the middle is the DNA, the control center of the cell. And this is a chemical, a representation of DNA that an organic chemist would make, or someone like me. I used to be able to draw it by heart. I don't know if I could do it anymore. But this is the more famous representation, this double helix. Watson and Crick, the discoverers of the DNA. Well, they use this as Rosalind Franklin, I think's data. Fuzzy blobs on an X-ray. They did some maths, and they came up with a double helix. Quite clever. It was a theory. It was theoretical mathematical work that they'd done to produce this model. But everything we've done since then has confirmed that this is the way it is. And actually, I was very excited, 2012, when we saw it, it's another fuzzy squiggle, that is a DNA double helix. Obviously under quite artificial circumstances to get a microscope picture of it. Normally it's in a squishy cell full of water and tons of other stuff going on. But that is, when you get a naked DNA double helix, that's what it looks like using atomic force microscopy. The smaller you want to look, the bigger your microscope gets. These things are sort of big microscopes. And for me, a more familiar look at DNA was this. This is a karyotype. So at some point before a cell divides, the DNA condenses into these little, well, when you stain them with fluorescent dyes, they look like stripy socks. In fact, in lockdown, we did a stripy sock competition to see who can make a lovely karyotype. This is a woman's chromosomes, a human woman's chromosomes all laid out. So each chromosome is a chunk of DNA wrapped up like an old-fashioned telephone wire. You know, you twisted it, it started going funny ways, and you could get all into a tangle and go very small. That's what you're doing with DNA, coiling, supercoiling, coiling back on itself, coiling again. But if you unwrapped them all, this DNA, in these, you couldn't see these with the naked eye, these tiny little coiled up chromosomes, is 2 meters of DNA. You couldn't see it because it's too thin, but if you took the DNA out of just one of our cells that you can't see, 2 meters. And when you think about how many cells we must have in our bodies, I was told we had enough DNA in our body to go to the moon and back. And actually, when I was doing bedtime with my friend's little boy, he told me this. He said, you can go to the moon and back. He loves numbers, but he was very tired and slightly ill. So he was like, I think it might be 3 times. And I was able to say to the smart 9-year-old, actually, I think it might be further. I didn't have time to go through all the numbers with him, but let's do it here. Starting off with your 2 meters of DNA in a human cell. The hardest part of the calculation is how many cells are in the human body. DNA-containing cells are red blood cells, of which there are many. They don't have any DNA in them anymore because that got broken down to make room for your hemoglobin. But all the other cells have DNA in them. The estimate I had was, oh, my number 3 is gone, 3 trillion. So 3 and 12 zeros. That's quite a conservative estimate. So a biologist, which I'll quote later, he thought, I think like 30 to 50. That's often I use a more conservative estimate because it's more fun. Because when if it goes far, I'm not just making things up to make you go, wow. It really is quite a conservative estimate. So you've got 6 trillion meters of DNA in your body. Can't even understand a million, let alone a trillion. But even 1,000 is quite big to imagine. 6 billion kilometers. How far is it to the moon? Someone always knows. Does anyone want to? 238,000 miles, or 380,000 kilometers. Yes. I know. Yes, I know, I'm sorry. I've hamstrung everyone by going metric. Sorry. So 380,000 kilometers to the moon is nothing compared to the amount of DNA in our bodies. In the average human body, I should say, if you're a bit bigger, you'll have a bit more. If you're a bit smaller, you'll have a bit less. Also, a slightly different cancer risk if you've got a different number of cells. But anyway, that's by the by. How far is it to the sun? Let's look at something further away. Oh, lots of people know. Okay, I don't remember numbers, so I'm always very impressed when people remember numbers. Nice, around 150,000 in kilometers. That's a astronomical unit. 1 astronomical unit is how far it is to the sun. Still nothing, nowhere near 6 billion kilometers. So let's go as far out as we can get in the solar system. I know it's not a planet anymore, but it's really far away. Does anyone know how far? Okay, well, they have elliptical orbits anyway, so, you know, it's different all the time. But at some point in its orbit, Pluto is 6 billion kilometers away. So the average human, if you took all the DNA out of your body, stretched it out end to end, stretched it out, added it end to end, it would at least go to Pluto. It's just amazing. As I said, biologists like complexity. And this is the kind of feeling, I talked to a couple of astronomers, met a couple of astronomers, and both of them at separate incidents said they don't attempt to hold these big numbers in their head because it would just send them a bit funny. They just work in shorthand most of the time. And very occasionally, when they're giving a talk to the general public, they'll spell it all out and they'll feel the wonder as well. You know, amazing. But this is, again, quite little writing, I'm sorry. But if you go to Google Brandon Vaidyanathan, you can find his webpage on the Catholic University of Washington of America website, and you'll find a link to this data from his Beauty Wellbeing at Work study. You can have a look at all this data. It's quite fun. But they asked a question, when did you feel a sense of reverence or respect about the things you were discovering? And the numbers here, so the yellow is never, 10%. And then the rest is rarely to through a few times a year, to a few times a month, to weekly or more. So weekly, very common, is rare, is not very many of them. Never is not very many. In the middle, you've got people who are at least occasionally, a few times a month or every now and again in their career, experiencing this deep sense of reverence or respect about the things they were discovering. And rarely is quite often for a scientist, because most of the time you're just trying to raise money for your experiments, get your experiments working, teach your students, write up your papers, go to conferences, make your dinner, all this kind of stuff, to be able to actually look at your data and have a bit of a moment. That's quite rare. So a rare experience of awe is quite a big deal. And usually the kind of thing, I have a friend who said when she was a student, she found something new. She would just have to go and find someone to tell this to. And sometimes it was someone hoovering the corridor because it was late. And she'd be like, I've just done this thing. And they're like, yes, dear. Okay, fine. But you just had to tell someone. Or the other question was, I felt that I was in the presence of something grand. And again, you've got only 13% of people saying, no, I don't feel that. It's a bit weird. Everyone else is feeling it, usually fairly rarely, and a few, very sensitive people feeling it quite often, but mostly feeling in the presence of something grand when they're doing their work. That's quite a big feeling. Or the last one is, I felt my sense of self become somehow smaller in the face of what I was researching. And that's a measure of quite deep awe. That's kind of one of the definitions of awe. So 27% of people saying, no, I didn't feel that. It's beginning to sound a bit, I don't know, not in their comfort zone. But 73% of the scientists they interviewed or that did this survey said, yeah, I felt that. That kind of experience of the transcendent. And, there may be a story, maybe you only have one story of a feeling like that in your whole career, or 2 or 3 if you're lucky. And they're the kind of things Nobel Prize winners write books about. Once you're confident, you can talk about big feelings without people judging you. Not that I think people would judge you, but it's quite personal. You've got Edwin Hubble, who had a space telescope named after him. He said this, sometimes through a strong, compelling experience of mystical insight, a man knows beyond the shadow of doubt that he has been in touch with a reality that lies beyond mere phenomena. He himself is completely convinced, but he cannot communicate the certainty. It is a private revelation. He may be right, but unless we share his ecstasy, we cannot know. mystical insight, is quite spiritual language, and he's representative of a whole generation of physicists who kind of reached out for language to describe these experiences and kind of picked up on quite the language of their generation, a sort of spiritual, religious language. And people still do it. This is Brian Cox from Not Very Far Away, where the cosmos made conscious and life is the means by which the universe understands itself. He's a humanist, so he's using sort of humanist language. Or you go back to Einstein, a belief bound up with deep feeling in a superior mind that reveals itself in the world of experience, represents my conception of God. So he didn't believe in a personal God, he believed in kind of a mind behind the universe. That's what his work convinced him existed. Always God does not play dice, all these kinds of things, very mathematically informed statements. And I think what's going on here is captured, I think, quite well by this guy, Enrico Cantor. He was a Jesuit philosopher who interviewed lots of physicists, Werner Heisenberg, and lots of people like this. And he talked about these big transcendent moments where you're coming into contact with something that sort of goes beyond science. But he said, it's a form of knowledge. It's something so intelligible. You look at the periodic table and think, how did that happen? That the world is arranged in such a way that we can understand it in this tabular format and predict what elements we need to go and discover. And then they found them and put them in the table. I mean, it's incredible story. He said, this feeling of the transcendent is like the darkness that is felt when one is overwhelmed by dazzling light. So there's so much we can understand. It's kind of dazzling. So it's like too much knowledge, and people start using this mystical language. Or the joy of feeling inundated by the dazzling light of this exceeding intelligibility. It's kind of too much for our minds to take that we can understand so much. If you like this kind of stuff, you can really dig. This is a very old book by Enrico Cantor that I stumbled across. I'm really glad, but had fantastic quotes from lots of scientists. And what he said resonated with me with something that the theologian Alistair McGrath said about Christian faith, which is that it goes beyond the rational. That, you have irrational, you have rational, and then you have so rational we can barely understand it and get our minds around it. Which is his view of Christianity, that it's not totally intuitive to our minds because, it makes too much sense in a way. So I'll go on to some Christian scientists. This one is Donna Augusti, who's a computer scientist working in industry, running her own companies. I think that everything around us is a gift, and we're invited to explore it. Or you have Simon Conway Morris in Cambridge. If I look at the natural world, I see that it's very highly ordered. It allows consciousness to emerge. It allows people to understand things, to create things themselves. And all of that I regard as being consistent with the existence of God. Cautious statement by a cautious Cambridge scientist, but it's quite strong for a cautious Cambridge scientist. I think, looking at the story I told you about DNA, that takes me is, Psalm 139, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and combine that with the heavens declare the glory of God. Kind of brings the two together, the very world of the very small and the world of the very large. And also it brings the world of science and faith together. So my science I'm doing is feeding directly into my Christian faith and exploding it, in a brilliant way, And that's what, people sometimes come to me and say, oh, it must be difficult to be a Christian in science. But actually, when I talk to my friends who are Christians who are still in the lab, it's hard doing science, but, when they make discoveries, it really fuels their faith. They're finding stuff out about the world that's exciting and new. You have this guy, Robert Selvendron, sadly passed away recently, a plant scientist. Together, both types of truth, science and Christianity, give a fuller, a more meaningful picture of life, of the world, and indeed of the universe. So he was researching tea. And This is my view of science and Christianity. It's the Venn diagram of my life. Now you know I'm a geek, really. So my Christian faith is kind of the big circle that encompasses everything. And then anything else is an activity that happens within that. So I can do science, I can go to sleep, I can have friends, I can have a meal, I can have hobbies. For different people, the circles would be different sizes, they would overlap in different ways. And but my Christian values, my Christian beliefs colour everything I do. Some of those activities will be bounded. So if I study leukemia in the lab, disease progression could help me. I might be quite excited. It helps me to understand the normal workings of our bodies and how we might cure leukemia. But if I go to visit someone in hospital who has leukemia, I am absolutely not excited about their disease. I love them. I want them to get better. And it would be completely inappropriate for me to ask about their disease progression and be like, oh, it's really exciting. Can I have a sample? No, completely inappropriate. Those are two very different places in life. So, but both of those times, I might pray that I do my experiments well. I would definitely pray for my friend to get better, So they're boundaried experiences that are coloured by my Christian faith. It's not that Christian faith and science are jostling to occupy the same space. They're complementary. So this is how science feeds into Christian faith. And those of you who are scientists here could tell your own stories about how that happens. And we'd love to hear from you in the Q&A time. But Christian faith feeds back into science. Theology informed science right from the beginning. This is how they justified the work they were doing and the money they were wanting to spend on science. This is God's got good creation. We want to explore it. He's put us in a place of responsibility to look after it. Everything out there depends on God to make it happen. He created it. We don't know how it's going to be. We have to go and explore it, and we can study it. We're supposed to. He's put us in this position of responsibility. And unless we understand it, we've found to our cost. We can't look after it properly. And then there was also the idea of scientific law. People read the Bible and looked at the world and were living in an agricultural society, thinking there are regular patterns here, behaviours of things, seasons, the stars going around, and they expected to be able to understand the mechanisms by which those things happened and the regular behaviours of things. And that's what they found. So they found that things behave according to laws, especially if you get down into a small scale of atoms and molecules. They start to behave according to law, speed of light, and is very useful, helps us to understand and explain the world. So theology informed science as well as science informing our Christian faith. So I want to map out, just in the last little while, a theology of science. So I'm just looking at the rest of my slides, and then I'll talk a little bit about worship. So, theology of science. Being a scientist, I want to get the assumptions out there so we're all clear on what's going on before I get to the theology of science part. So I believe that everything belongs to God. I'm not into natural, supernatural divide or thinking that just because it's called nature, that means it's not God's. So none of that. Everything is God's. He made it all. It's all there because of him. God is a rational being. He creates order. Okay, sometimes he uses stochastic or random processes in order to create that order, in the same way that you roll a dice in order to play a game. You know exactly what's going on there. You know you're going to get a 6-1 in 6 times if you throw the dice enough times. So you can use disorder to create order. So God's doing that often. Science complements theology in a number of ways. Science is all about understanding the mechanisms, and theology is all about understanding the meanings of things. Or you could describe that relationship in another way. We have the revealed knowledge of God and his purposes through his interaction with people, recorded in the Bible, in the history of the church. And then that complements the scientific knowledge that we have of everything he's made. And I use the word creation very broadly. I'm not talking about that I'm very happy with the way that scientists understand the origins of the world and the origins of life. Creation is just everything God does. Or a third way of describing it is as God is the primary cause. He's the reason why everything is there. And he's put in place secondary causes that scientists study. Speed of light, gravity, all that kind of stuff. The way the world takes over, the way that life emerges from a bundle of chemicals, very exciting. So those secondary causes keep going, we study those. And last sort of assumption behind my theology of science, and assumption for most humans in the world, we do science and we should use science in ethical ways. So once you've got all that in the background, we can then think of a theology of science. Sorry, I'm a bit hoarse today. I value science. We do science because it's valuable in and of itself. We don't get to say that in grant applications, sadly. It's fun. I just want to do it. I'm curious. But it's true. If what God made is very good, if it all praises him, a lot of the Psalms say, if it brings glory to him, it's a witness to him, this is what the language of the Bible, then goodness, we should understand it. We should go out and explore and enjoy, poke, prod, try to understand what's going on. That's a way of saying thank you to God for everything he's made. If I love God, then I love his creation. I want to explore it. So we do it because, we need to, because it's valuable in itself. But it's also useful. It helps people to worship him. You learn your DNA story and then you recite the Psalms, as I did. We can learn wisdom from it. You just have to read Proverbs to see that. Or I spent 3 months in the USA and getting familiar with reading about some of the indigenous cultures there. There's a lot of learning from creation there, learning from nature. Very wise. The more we know about the world, exploring the world scientifically is also a bit therapeutic. Okay, not if you're having to do it quickly, you're a bit stressed, or your money's running out, or you've got to do a PhD thesis. But I think it's very good for us to explore the world. It's also obviously very useful to help us care for people and the rest of creation. And like any occupation, paid or unpaid, it is a crucible for character formation. You don't need to be a Christian to be able to say that, but you do need to be a Christian to be able to say, this is a place where I can demonstrate what it looks like to follow Jesus. I've dropped my experiment and I find a way to carry on. Or someone else drops their experiment and I'm comforting them. Well, my experiment just worked out, but I'm not shouting about it because they've just dropped theirs. There's ways of helping people and just demonstrating what it looks like to follow Jesus in the lab. So that's my very, very simple theology of science. And lots of people have outlined theology of science in different ways, but that's how I express mine. And it works out, in places like this. This was on the Applecross Peninsula on the west coast of Scotland. It's a little patch of temperate rainforest. It's about as close as you can get to old growth forest in Scotland. Nothing like as impressive as the massive trees on the west coast of the USA that I saw, northwest coast, earlier this year, but just as beautiful. So this was in the summer. Insects were buzzing as I sat here. Actually, the dog took us here. It must have smelled amazing. But with my human olfactory senses, I couldn't smell it. But I did go back without the dog later, just to sit for about an hour or so and take pictures. And this doesn't capture it, but there was a lot of colour. Thousands of species of different kinds of plants and lichen and fungi. And all my scientist senses are going here. I'm worshipping. I know there's so much that's useful in these plants that could be used. I really want to care for it. All those things in that theology of science, all the cylinders are going, as I'm having that experience. I saw my first slime mold, dog vomit slime mold, if you're into that kind of thing. Incredible. I tried to take a sound recording, but my phone didn't really capture it. So the last question people tend to ask, or one of the questions people tend to ask in this context is, what about proof for God? Does science prove God's existence? And I would say, no. The way I define science as building up layers of evidence, you don't prove things with science. You can disprove things, but only mathematicians prove things. So no scientific proof for God, sorry. You'll spot the traffic light code, orange. Can you have evidence for God? Some people are quite happy with this. They would call it natural theology, and they'd find arguments for the existence of God from nature. But cautiously, because people have taken this too far at times. And you look back a few hundred years, and some of the writings by scientists who are Christians look a little bit odd, because they're coming up with really definite evidence for God from very particular things that just don't make sense to us anymore, not to me. So I want to be very careful. And I also want people to put their faith in Jesus, not in science. Science is always moving. Jesus is an unchanging character, revelation of God's character. So I'd say handle with care. I mean, there is some great writing on the Faraday Institute website and talks by a chap called Rodney Holder, who talks about cosmic fine-tuning, so evidence from astronomy, that maybe there's some kind of mind behind the universe, sort of Einstein God. It doesn't get you very far. It gets you to a sort of, maybe this is some kind of God. I think that's about as far as you can get. I'm much happier, and this, I've mentioned Alistair McGrath before, and this is his sort of way of seeing things, is theology as a lens. So you could do a thought experiment if you weren't a Christian believer and think, well, let's look at the world. It's ordered, it's fruitful. It really surprises us sometimes, quantum entanglement, so this idea that a particle on one side of the universe can influence one or the other. It's very unintuitive, but scientific evidence for that happening. So all these things that science finds out, he thinks, and I think, Christianity makes sense of. This is a God who provides for us, who brings order out of chaos, who acts according to his wisdom, not our wisdom. I think all these things make sense when you look at the world that science reveals through the lens of Christian theology. So that's kind of my take on, does science prove God? No, but there's some other interesting things you can think of. So I'll just finish with a few little stories about science, that back to science leading worship. This is my friend Rhoda Hawkins, and she studies cells. You can see these little grey blobs moving around. This is speeded up quite considerably. But she, as a physicist, will look at cells and ask, what makes it move? Why is it alive and not dead? You know, physicists talk about active matter. So this is stuff that, with an input of energy, lots of energy, can organize itself and move around. And she asks difficult questions that biologists don't know the answer to, and that makes her head nearly burst with difficult mathematical descriptions of things. And she loves it, and will say things like this: on a day-to-day basis as a scientist, you're usually involved in the details. Then every now and then you get to a point where you can step back and look at the overview and go, wow, that's actually something we're beginning to make sense of. That wonder, for me personally, is also a kind of wonder at God's creation. It's worship, in a sense. And Bach, he would write at the beginning of when he was composing, he wrote, this is a Jesuit habit, I'm told, SDG, short for JJ, short for Jesu Juve at the beginning, sort of Jesus help me. Then he'd do his composing, and then at the end he would write SDG, which is short for Soli Deo Gloria, glory to God alone, at the end. And this woman, Catherine Crouch, for a time wrote this in her lab books to remind her, God help me, and then she would do all her work, and this to her was a kind of worship, just like Bach's beautiful music was, and then at the end she'd write, glory to God alone. And actually this guy, Fernando Caballero, in his PhD thesis, so his big work, he submitted to become qualified as a scientist, he wrote this, Soli Deo Gloria, at the beginning as the sort of dedication And actually, it caused quite a discussion. So this was in Spain. It caused quite a discussion in his oral exam for that piece of work. I was a little bit nervous because one of the people there was this, big shot paleontologist. He was studying these little microfossils. Sorry, my picture's kind of grey there. I should find a better picture of a microfossil. They're really stunning. And there was this huge discussion, and then he got this letter, or maybe it was an email, from this big shot paleontologist afterwards, and thought, oh, what have I done? I've shot myself in the foot in my career. But then this guy said, I've written it down. So you knew this guy didn't have a professor Christian faith. You thought, this is a guy who's going to get it. But this guy said, to your soli Deo gloria, I say magnus in magnis, maximus in minimis, which is a quote that is attributed to Augustine, this theologian. God is great in the big things, but is greatest in the small things. So in other words, these microfossils, these are displaying God's glory the best. These tiny little things. So that's very unusual, but clearly he had his own spirituality that was fueled by his science. And yeah, I think, so I'll finish with one more story, and then you can tell me yours. So here's a worm, one of these worms that I was showing you earlier. This guy, Jeff Harden, thinks they're totally beautiful. And he says, when he talks about why he does this research, he says, you can learn a lot about a Mercedes by studying a Toyota. In other words, I can learn a lot about our bodies by studying these tiny worms. And he has said, when you go on a hike and there's a beautiful view that not many people know about, the natural response is to want to share that with somebody. I think the same is true in science, and as a Christian, I want to share that discovery with God himself. It becomes an act of worship for me. So this is one way to go with the data. We have the beauty, the creativity, the wonder, the awe, and it doesn't tell you what to believe. So for me as a Christian, my Christian faith makes perfect sense of what science shows me about the world. Other people will interpret it differently. In order to decide, you have to go beyond science into other areas of life. Does God answer prayer? Does the Bible make sense? Does the church function well? These kinds of things. In order to make it, to decide, does Christian faith make sense? So that's my views on science and faith. God in the lab, how science enhances faith. And over to you now. If you enjoy this kind of thing, if you'd like to find out more in depth or in less depth or whatever, do go to the Faraday Institute website. This QR code you can use it will take you to the website, but also mainly to the page that will help you to sign up for some regular news. Or if you're not into smartphones, there's a sheet at the back you can write your email address on. And do stay in touch. And obviously go and look at the other Gilbert Scott lectures as well. So I think we've got, hopefully, a good amount of time for questions and, those of you in science, your experiences, anything that resonates here, anything you interpret these experiences differently. Love to hear from you. So over to you.